annual meeting and award ceremony via Zoom. I would like to thank you for joining us tonight and recognize this year's award recipients for their contribution to science. I also would like to take this opportunity to appreciate our board members that volunteered their time and establish new collaborations with other organizations. The Academy brings together local scientists and encourages collaboration and creates enabling environment for the youth through its Junior Academy. I do not want to take too much of your time, but just wanted to emphasize that you can work with the Academy. You can contact me at any time or other board members to learn how you can get involved with the Academy. At this time, I would like to ask Dr. Sriram to introduce tonight's great speaker. Again, a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you.
Anyway, we are, today our keynote speaker is Yolanda Gil, and she's the Director for Major Strategic Artificial Intelligence and Data Science Initiatives at the Information Sciences Institute at USI. I've known Yolanda for over 3 decades, and she has been doing pioneering work in artificial intelligence. And she and I actually have PhDs from Carnegie Mellon University, which you all know about their pioneering work in AI. And Yolanda is also served as the past president of the Association for Artificial Intelligence. And she has been working on this notion of, can actually computers write scientific papers? So our dream, our vision is in the future.
Thank you, Ram. I'm very excited to be part of this group, and my thinking is always in Washington and how can we connect better with those of you that are members of this Washington Academy of Sciences and others that think imaginatively about the importance of the government support for science and to increase our imagination with respect to what science is able to do for society. Okay. All right. So, so I was thanking you all for this opportunity, and congratulations to the new members of the Academy. It's very exciting to see a scientific body grow like this. So I want to talk to you, as Ram was mentioning, about some thoughts for how AI can partner with scientists. We often hear about AI being an assistant or being an associate that provides help or suggestions to scientists. Sometimes we hear about automation. Sometimes you hear about AI automating some machine learning task, but I really want to think about how to create AI systems that can partner with scientists and take on responsibilities over some of the business of science. Ram, I think if you minimize the right side of the or the panel, I think there's some ad that is showing.
Oh, okay, that's right, okay. And how do I?
Thank you. And I'll keep talking. So AI is in the forefront of our thinking, and we've seen many exciting things come out of the field of AI. I want to broaden your sense of the great contributions that have come out of this field. So at the top of this slide, you see examples that come more from a data driven tradition in AI. So machine learning systems that are recommender systems, robotic systems that act autonomously, like you see in the self-driving car technologies. But there's also interesting ways in which AI systems are learning to behave and perform better and collaborate. And examples of these are the robot soccer teams. In the bottom of the screen is a different tradition of AI that you may or may not be aware of, but it is more on the reasoning and thinking and knowledge aware side. So examples of this are the IBM Watson system that won against the best Jeopardy player. It's a question answer game if you're familiar with it. In the middle, I show the Google Knowledge Graph, which helps drive a lot of the prioritization of answers to web searches. And then on the right is Apple Siri that actually will carry out some tasks. There's many of such kind of assistants that understand voice and map your commands to tasks that they can do for you. So this task understanding, this understanding of entities in the world, this understanding of general knowledge is in this knowledge tradition. And if you go to the next slide, I try to highlight these, this data thread, this data tradition in AI, and this knowledge thread and knowledge tradition in AI. And in the next slide, I'll show you examples of each of these things in the science area. So for example, on the machine learning side, there's systems that have looked at climate data and discovered some of the climate dipoles through machine learning. Just like you see self-driving cars, you see also self-driving robots, not just in Mars, but also at the bottom of the ocean doing some of the prioritization, deciding which routes are more interesting and so on. And then there's a lot of robot automation doing tasks in the lab. I understand there's some of these robots deployed at NIH, and there's a lot of startup companies doing some of the lab automation tasks. On the knowledge tradition, there's also great advances. So there's a lot of great work on understanding articles and extracting information from articles so that one can answer questions about them. There's also great work on knowledge graphs. I show here an example from Open Facts where a big knowledge graph of entities of interest to pharmaceutical companies was developed in a big consortium, and they ask it to access non-proprietary information that they all share from open sources. And then on this task-oriented problem-solving side, we see more and more workflow systems that understand scientific tasks and carry them out. So there's a lot of impact that AI is having in science. In the next slide, I'll show some prominent examples from the last few months, since those are more, for the last few years. And so from machine learning that you see at the top, from deep learning for protein structure prediction, extracting from the literature, to the two examples at the bottom that are more on knowledge graphs for hypothesis formation and also constrained reasoning for sustainability and environmental sustainability. So science had a special issue that was titled AI Transforming Science already. So I just wanted to give you this background to see that the applications of AI in science are quite broad and come from many fields, not just from machine learning. In the next slide, I show you that AI has had a long tradition in terms of looking at scientific discovery and taking it as an area of study. Initially through Herb Simon, who was one of the founders of our field, also a Nobel Prize in economics, very early on wanted to understand how scientific behaviors and cognition devoted to scientific discovery may be similar or different from other forms of human problem solving. There were a lot of different pieces of work. I have pictures here from the Stanford team, Feigenbaum and Buchanan and Joshua Lederberg, also a Nobel Prize recipient in biology, looking at ways to discover molecular structure. A lot of different computational systems that imitated or replicated the way that humans reason about science in different ways, both from this data thread that I mentioned, but also from the knowledge thread that I mentioned. So this has been a really close link for many, many years. In the next slide, I give you the gist of the messages that I would like to convey in this talk. So in the rest of the talk, I'll hit each of these four pieces, kind of elaborating and just telling you more about. The first point is that knowledge technologies in that knowledge thread of AI is becoming increasingly important as a supplement to the data thread, the more machine learning driven behaviors, data-driven behaviors that we can develop with AI, but they're increasingly important because they also complement the data with scientific theories and knowledge. So very important message to convey to you. The second point is that AI offers, when we develop AI reasoners and AI systems, they offer a more systematic, correct, and unbiased approaches to science, which humans not always provide. And they also give us rigorous reporting. So this is very important for reproducibility and other aspects of building on solid science. So AI can contribute in that way. My third point is that where AI can really contribute the most, I think, is in the pursuit of interdisciplinary frontiers, because it's becoming more and more challenging for individual laboratories and the overhead of interdisciplinary collaborations. And I'm sure that many members of this academy are engaged in, they take a lot of effort. And so AI can really facilitate and bridge across disciplines really well, I think. And then my last point is that I want to share with you some ideas about this concept that I have of thoughtful AI systems, thoughtful AI that will really use knowledge to be effective partners with humans. So these are my four messages in this talk, and I'll go through each one in turn. In the next slide, I'll just show the first one at the top, why knowledge technologies are increasingly important. If you go to the next slide. So there's more and more interest in knowledge technologies. As I said, they complement these data tradition in AI, machine learning, but also they're providing incredible value. In a lot of the big tech companies and other large companies, there are individual knowledge graphs that those companies exploit to improve their businesses in many ways. So all the major tech companies use this technology, both in the US, in China, in Europe. There's a nice recent survey in the communications of the ACM showing the content of these knowledge graphs, the different types of entities that are represented there, the connections between these entities. So if you look at the knowledge graph in eBay, it will focus more on products. If you look at the knowledge graph for Google search, it will focus a lot on persons of interest, locations, etc. Another area where knowledge is showing a lot of excitement is in extracting a long-standing problem in AI, extracting information about this long-standing problem, which is to give AI systems common sense or common knowledge about the world that we all know and assume. And so understanding why a robot in the home should know what rooms are for what, or why it shouldn't be operating at night, or when somebody's taking a nap, it shouldn't be vacuuming next to that person. This requires common sense. That's what we would think humans have. And so providing this common sense to humans has been a long-standing challenge for AI. And we've seen a lot of advances in terms of extracting this knowledge from text and from images. Another area that has also seen advances and interest in this knowledge thread is in explaining what AI systems are doing and explainable machine learning as well. So this means linking the maybe sub-symbolic or functions that are represented in AI systems and mapping them to more symbolic explanations or narratives about why a certain prediction is being made. Another reason is to deal with adversarial examples. So these are examples that look very much like the regular examples that in machine learning has been shown, but lead to radically different behaviors that are unwanted. If you're familiar with this, this is a very big challenge that if you understand a bit more about the problem, it can be really helpful. Another area that has also sparked a lot of interest in knowledge, particularly in scientific domains, is this idea of theory-guided data science or theory-guided machine learning, where you're looking at data, but you're also infusing the machine learning systems with constraints that come from the physical world. So those constraints really guide these machine learning systems to create models that are consistent with the physics knowledge or whatever domain of expertise. So there's more and more interest on these knowledge technologies that have come out of AI and embedding them more into AI systems coming from all these sides. So that's my first point, that knowledge is very important. In the next slide, knowledge technologies are increasingly important. You'll hear more and more about them in the coming decade and years. My second point, building on that, is that if we trust AI systems to actually understand the problems and have knowledge about, more knowledge about science, they will be able to offer more systematic, correct, unbiased approaches and more rigorous reporting. So in the next slide, I'll show you some examples of this. Thank you, Ram. So there's human limitations that affect our ability to make progress in science. So one example is that humans are not necessarily very systematic. So the citation that I give here comes from a system that demonstrated how extracting from text, from the literature, facts about the fossil record reported in papers actually did a better job than a manual effort that was done over a period of 10 years to extract those facts about the fossil record by a group of humans. And so what this showed is that I was actually very surprised, because the quality of text extraction, the accuracy, is not necessarily very high. So the fact that even with the limited accuracy, because it's very hard for a natural language extraction system to do well at these tasks, even with those limitations, it did better than a human manual effort that took 10 years. And so you know, as much as AI systems may not be correct, we cannot believe that the AI efforts that endeavor to do similar tasks are correct, in fact. The other example that I use is an example about how humans make errors. So my example is from a student at UMass Amherst that tried to reproduce the results of an economics paper from 2 Harvard professors. And he was not able to do this. He was trying to use all the data in the tables in the paper, and he did not get the same results. And after some back and forth, what they realized is that basically the spreadsheets that they had used to do the analysis, in the calculations, they had omitted a few rows, a few countries, basically. And so the overall recommendations stood, but there were errors in the analysis that were committed. So, and I think that, you know, in this group, I'm sure you're familiar with retractions of papers, because there's human error many times. Some of these retractions come from Nobel Award winners, for example. Another example about the limitations of humans are biases. So these are biases that have to do with how humans sometimes think of hypotheses that fit their preferences. And so this is from an AI system that reasoned about paleoclimate hypotheses and presented all the hypotheses consistent with the data to the authors of a study, and you know, wondering why some hypotheses that were consistent with the data were not even mentioned in the publications. And so I think that humans also present biases. And then finally, poor reporting is very, very hard to build on prior work when it's really hard to reproduce what was done and follow those methods. And I show on the right some studies that we did that mark in red pieces of analysis that are just really hard. They require too much effort and very, very fine-tuned knowledge to reproduce. So AI can really offer this systematic, correct, and unbiased approaches to science and more rigorous reporting. In the next slide, you'll see that I basically use this picture to say, let's look at ourselves and not think that AI has all these limitations, but also realize that we as humans have also these limitations. That I often talk about AI as, my hope for AI systems that they'll help humans become better. In the next slide, I go to this view that I spend a lot of time basically reading studies from the philosophy of science, from cognitive science, about how humans do science and understanding those processes and trying to figure out how to build AI systems that can imitate them. In the next slide is my third point in the talk, which is that AI will excel at interdisciplinary frontiers. So in the next slide, I show an example from, or this high-level view about the big problems of our time, right? They're so interdisciplinary. We are trying to understand the origins of the universe, our planet, ecosystems, the brain, cognition. These are very interdisciplinary problems. In the next slide, I show a concrete trajectory of how collaborations in science have become more and more complex. The one on the very right shows the Atlas collaboration. It's a long way from when we would see books from individuals like Newton and Darwin advancing theories. Now papers may have 4,000 collaborators. In the next slide, I show an example from proteomics. If you go to one proteomics lab, they'll have expertise in some ranges of some of the squares that you see in this picture. On the right are different experimental skills. On the left are some computational skills. Each lab has a subset of all of these. And in the next slide, I'll show that even within proteomics, when we do these studies, and we've tried to automate some of these proteomic analysis, depending on the databases that we use as references, depending on the algorithms that we use, the results are very different, even though the questions and the data are the same. But the papers that are published really use one database as reference, one method, or one algorithm. And so AI could help us be a lot more systematic in this respect and integrate different skills and different disciplines. In the next slide, the point is that I think AI can help us bridge across different areas of knowledge. And even if one lab has a certain expertise, we can augment that with knowledge about other skills, other areas, and other disciplines. In the next slide, I'll give an example from integrating models across disciplines to model natural phenomena. So this is a project that we have called MINT for Model Integration, where we're looking at food insecurity in some regions like Ethiopia, or water shortages and droughts in Texas and California. And you have to really meld together economic models with agriculture, with hydrology models. And this presents many challenges, and integrated models takes months, maybe years to create for a particular small region. They just take incredible human effort. In the next slide, I show how we have been using AI to capture a lot of the knowledge and the context about a model. And so using this knowledge and reasoning with it, we can help explore options, understand what model is better for a particular problem, and how to choose among possible models, link the models with interventions and decision making. So capturing more knowledge about these models really create systems that are more equipped to address these interdisciplinary problems of model integration. My next slide kind of summarizes this point that all of these challenges in interdisciplinary research, I think, we're really finding that a lot of the interdisciplinary work, especially with big science questions, are really hero efforts of 4,000 people. They're one of a kind, they're rare. I would love to see them become more ubiquitous because we're able to embed AI more in these science processes. The next slide. Thank you, Ram. I make my fourth and last point, which is this idea of how can AI be more of a partner with a scientist to help them do science. And here I'm not thinking about just an assistant or an AI that does a particular task, but really I want an AI that's really a partner, that really collaborates and really is at a level where a scientist can delegate or discuss with the AI system. So I call these thoughtful AI, and I have some principles to propose to give you an idea of the kind of direction and the vision that I see AI will pursue in the next 10 years or so. In the next slide, a very important piece is that if you want AI and humans to collaborate, it's very important that there's a process that recognizes the skills of each of them, and the process really is optimized to do the best in the problem. And so as we create these AI systems, we have to understand where are the areas and the responsibilities within the science ecosystem where we could have these AI partners work. So the example that I use here is freestyle chess. The current champion is on the left. That's him and his team. The freestyle chess is played, it was invented by Garry Kasparov. Each team is any combination of humans and computers. It can be supercomputers, it can be several chess playing programs, it can be as many humans, chess masters, grandmasters, anyone. And what they found in those competitions is that if the process is really good, then the humans or the machines don't have to be the best. And so to me, this really tells us that, we won't have AIs that can handle incredible challenges in science. We won't have humans that can handle incredible challenges in science, but the combination of AIs and humans collaborating in different aspects of these very, very complex problems will be a success, and understanding these processes will be key. In the next slide, I show that convergence of the AI and the human collaboration. The next slide will show the basic principles for these thoughtful AI, and I'll go very quickly through these. There's a paper if you're curious and want more details, but there's 7 basic principles that, as a scientist myself, I wish AI systems will have before I consider them as partners. So let me show you one by one. The next slide shows the first, the rationality principle. This means that I would want that AI partner system to have knowledge, to be able to describe to me the knowledge that it has, and that knowledge should guide the analysis they do, all of their behaviors and the findings that they make. And so we put a lot of effort in my group and in my research to understand knowledge structures that are useful in science, how to represent them, how to connect them, how to exploit them, and how to reason with them to support the behavior of our systems and how they're guided by this knowledge. The second principle is that I would want these, in the next slide, I would want these AI partner systems. Thank you, Ram. Can you move to the next slide? Please, thank you. The next principle is the context principle. So I would want these AI partners to not just do what I tell them because I tell them or because I suggested it, but to really have some context about what they're doing so they can answer their own questions if they need to in doing the work. And so we put a lot of work also in my group in understanding, exactly what is it that you're trying to answer when you ask an AI system to run a model or to do some kind of data analysis. So we spend a lot of time thinking, what are the hypotheses that we are after? What are the questions that we are posing, and what kinds of questions are they? So I think a lot more work needs to go into this, understanding the context of a particular science task. In the next slide, the next principle is for these AI partners to take initiative. I don't want to be in a position where I have to teach them everything, keep them up to speed. I want them to be able to have this initiative to drive their learning and be able to answer their own questions. I think that's very fundamental. And I think it's something that we can do with AI systems and make them have this capability in the next few years. In the next slide, the network principle means that they should be able to find resources that are available online, just like we use as humans, including contacting other researchers and having discussions or getting information from them. I think this is fundamental. The next slide is a principle of articulation. So I mean, not just explaining, I mean discussing. I mean, not just explaining, I had this finding and this is why, but also being able to answer tough questions about it, compare with other work, etc. And we're doing a lot of work on, as Ram mentioned, generating papers automatically that describe the methods that we have followed for an analysis. In the next slide, principle number 6 is that they should behave in what I call here an ethical way, but I think what they need to do is convey their limitations and their scope. So if I ask a system analyze X, Y, Z data, they shouldn't just do a poor job if they're not really skilled at analyzing that type of data. They should instead give me a sense of their capabilities. And finally, the next slide shows this systems principle, which means that I wish for AI system to be compositional or modular. So it's not good to have an AI system that recognizes dogs and another one that recognizes cats, but you cannot compose their capabilities to build something more complex. And until we understand that, then these partnerships and these teams are going to be very hard to build. The next slide summarizes these 7 principles, and I'll go to the next slide. That summarizes the 4 points that I made in my talk and conclude. I started by conveying that this thread in AI of really using knowledge in science is very important. I think it's going to be increasingly important. It already is. I think that AI has a lot of potential in supplementing and addressing some of the shortcomings that we have as humans and be more systematic, correct, unbiased, and better at reporting accurately. My third point was that I think AI will be particularly effective in tasks that cross across disciplinary boundaries to help us make them more ubiquitous and common. And then finally, this idea that defining a good process for how AI and humans can collaborate and partner together, and these principles of thoughtful AI that we need to do research on are critical. And I'm happy to take questions, Ram, if there's time.
Yolanda, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. And the floor is open for questions. We have a few minutes. The best way to do that is to put your question in the chat if you have a pressing question. And are there any questions?
And I just have a comment. I just want to thank you for such a very informative, but at the same time intriguing talk. I mean, discussing artificial intelligence, I mean, you made it sound so elegant. I mean, I've never seen any talk as elegant as yours. So thank you. I try to stay away from anything on artificial intelligence, but you made it easy. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, there is a question from Terry here, who's saying that is it time to discard the term artificial intelligence itself?
It may be too late. I know, so I had discussions about this with some of the founders of our field, John McCarthy and Herb Simon and Alan Newell and others. And my understanding is that they wanted to call it cognitive science. They wanted to have science in the name, and really the sense of the science of cognition. And before they were able to put together this Association for Artificial Intelligence, they wanted to call it the Association for the Advancement of Cognitive Science. But then a group of psychologists and linguists created that association, and the goal was to very, very focus on cognition and kind of leaving out artificial systems. And so as a result, we ended up with this niche of artificial intelligence, for lack of another better way to call this science. So maybe cognitive science would have been a better term. Maybe eventually we'll get these communities to work more together. I think my major concern is that not so much that we change the name, but that we really understand what researchers in this field mean by artificial intelligence. So what I do see is that artificial intelligence is often equated with applications of statistics, and that's not what it is. I see machine learning often equated as AI and interchangeably, and it is not the case that it is. And so I would really like to see, and it was my motivation to give this particular talk, for you to see that AI has much broader set of techniques to offer that range from constraint reasoning to dialogue systems to all sorts of learning from, for example, learning from explanations rather than from data. And so AI is a really broad field, and I hope that you know, when we talk about the field of AI, my priority is that we scope it properly and people understand it properly. Maybe the name can come later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. And if you go to this ethical principles, you had a slide with a diagram. You didn't really talk much about it. Can you say a few things about that slide? Can you see that, Yolanda, now?
Which slide? The ethical slide?
Yeah, the ethical principles slide, which has this EFGR and colon cancer and so on. So.
Yeah, so, you know, I know there's a lot of interest in the ethics of AI, and I want to say that I'm not an ethicist myself. I've started to collaborate with ethicists in the philosophy department, and I think that, you know, they're a much bigger authority. The reason to call this the ethical principle, very modestly called ethical principle, is that I think it is a disservice to have AI systems that you give them a task and they give you an answer. They should be able to tell you, you know, I don't really know that much about that, or I'm not very confident in my answer, or, you know, I've never done this before. And being able to convey their limitations and their scope is the ethical thing to do, because when we deal with other humans, that's one of the things that we're able to assess through conversation or through interaction. And the AI systems, like, you give me this question or this task, and I'll give you an answer. But the scope and the limitations are a very important aspect. I think the ethics of AI are much, much larger topic, and I'm not an expert on it. But I think this has to do with having more ethical behaviors, for sure.
We actually have a participant here who's a professor of ethics, Stephen Gable. Would you like to make a comment?
Oh, I think there are comments about the interplay between ethics and machine learning and artificial intelligence are quite interesting. You know, I'm not any expert in this particular field, but I do find the interplay to be kind of difficult sometimes to adjudicate or to come to a good sense about. So, for example, I think about, you know, machines making decisions completely without any kind of human input whatsoever. You know, thinking of automated weapon systems, for example, or self-driving cars in situations where people are in danger, and what kind of decision will the self-driving car make, you know, so we can get into different valuations or different principles of ethics, and which one will the self-driving car choose in these difficult situations. Will it steer itself out of the way to save, you know, a greater number of people, or possibly putting just one or two people in danger. So
I was going to say there's a wonderful study about that comes out of on the biology side on the use of CRISPR gene editing technologies and CRISPR technologies and the ethics of that. And I love this study, came out of the National Academies, because I think AI needs a study like that on ethics that says, you know, the way that that study looked at gene editing is to say there are certain ranges of edits that society is willing to accept as ethical and acceptable. And then there's a whole range of other things where we don't think there's any kind of consensus on the ethics of doing those things. And so making all of those things more explicit on AI, I think would be very beneficial. It's a wonderful study and a wonderful report. And I think it also speaks to the challenges that we face. You know, I respect ethicists very much. And I think we have, you know, AI researchers have much to learn from people like you, Stephen. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Yolanda. Again, there's one more question here, which talks about the scale. I'll read out the question for you. One of the most difficult class of problems we as scientists deal with are so-called wicked problems that incorporate complicated social issues with technical problems, example, climate change. One issue with these problems is that act on different scales at the same time, individuals and populations, local and planetary, etc. AI seems to work on one scale or plane at a time. Is this correct perception? And where are we headed in accounting for scale?
This is a great question. So I just spent 2 hours today talking to a group studying water systems in California and Texas, and the idea of participatory modeling, where you look at the human side and you know, really wicked problems, and the physics side, the science side, they'll say, I put models and narratives in front of the farmers, and then they tell me, oh yeah, I understand, and then they go off and they do something different. So I can't imagine a more wicked problem than this, right? That you're trying to really help maintain and sustain water resources, but the human side is kind of unpredictable and independent and uncontrollable, and they have the rights to the water and so on. So, you know, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how AI can help with these things. One idea that we are discussing is social sensing. So one thing is what people tell you they're going to do. Another thing is if you really create these social sensors that ask people, you know, what do you think others are going to do? They'll tell you right away, and they're really good at predicting that. And so, you know, what tools can we use to understand how humans behave so that we can give better data to our groundwater models and agriculture models? So I think this is a great area. The issue of multi-scale, you know, AI systems today are very limited. These are very complex models. I think integrating these models at multiple scales is still a science problem for the modelers themselves. It's a science and research problem for the data collectors, for the remote sensing, for the mid-range sensors. And it's also a problem for, you know, upscaling and downscaling models, for model integration. This is a huge problem. I think my point is that, you know, if it took 4,000 people to discover the Higgs boson for one of the experiments, it might take hundreds of people to address this and really have a good, accurate model of the aquifers in California so that they're sustainable. So let's bring AI into the picture so that it really helps us glue together all of that knowledge so that they are not unique things that we do rarely, but rather that we are better positioned to tackle these wicked problems. That's my hope. So I hope AI will really revolutionize science in the next 10 years, particularly with these multi-scale, wicked, multidisciplinary, human, physical, impossible problems.
Yeah. I think we are running out of time here. And one last question to you, Yolanda, is that when do you think we'll see that paper written by AI in Science and Nature?
But that's a very good question. So, you know, we had at the Turing Institute in London a workshop in March because a colleague of mine in Japan, Hiroaki Kitano, he's an AI researcher turned biologist. He wrote a paper 3 years ago on AI to win a Nobel Prize in biology. What would it take? And we had this meeting in London to discuss you know, AI to win the Nobel Prize or to do Nobel quality research. What would it take and how many years? And we had a lot of material science, chemistry, geoscience, biology people there, and a lot of AI researchers as well. And I can tell you that after 3 days of discussions of understanding each other's problems, you know, challenges and so on, I asked in the last day, my guess would be 2080 would be when AI systems can do Nobel quality research. And the entire group said, no, 2050 for sure. So I was at odds with all the rest of the group. But this, I think that this tells you that there is this really strong promise that I think if we really start to work together towards it, that these AI systems will really be able to you know, contribute to science in very, very new, creative, and very necessary way to make it more mundane that we work on these complex, interdisciplinary, wicked problems. So if 2050 is when I guess the community thinks we'll have AI systems generating Nobel quality research, my guess would be 2020 to publish these really solid papers in Science or Nature.
Okay.
Depends on how many people. Depends on how many people collaborate to build these AIs. I hope you all are motivated to do that.
You mentioned a very important point, because there is this whole notion of large knowledge graphs have to be built before anything happens, and that's one of the things that you mentioned in your talk. You know, give you a big hand on behalf of everyone, and people, they can unmute and give it to you, and we will be continuing to the next session. Yolanda, again, thanks again, and I'm going to unshare.
Thank you for having me
around here, and again, thank you very much. It's really, it was very nice of you to accommodate us in your hectic schedule.